I'm Ben Hughes. It's my Twitter name. Brand new to San Diego. I actually just moved here 2 weeks ago to escape the snow in upstate New York. I do development for Ruby full-time on a freelance basis. And I'm going to talk about sort of two topics today. And they're not really related, except that I'm using them together. So I'll start off by talking about message block, which is a technique for showing user alerts. And then after that, I'll go into how I test it using Cucumber. So what I mean by user alerts, and there's really two things that we commonly do in Rails applications for alerting the user to different things. You flash messaging, very common. And you also have active record errors, sort of a separate thing, but it fulfills the same purpose. I mean, at the end of the day, you want to let the user know either something went wrong or something succeeded or whatnot. And so I started creating this gem that would kind of combine them, and it's kind of expanded to some new features and so on. But you know, currently, how you might display this in the view is right there. So you have a separate block where you just output the flash with maybe a class or something, and then Rails, of course, has a helper called error messages for, which will emit you know, a nice list of active record errors, but they're not combined. They don't fulfill the same purpose, really. So message block is a Rails gem plugin, and some things that it does, it merges them together, so you can treat them as the same. So if you have an error in your flash and an error in your active record model, they can be merged together. It does group them by message types. So oftentimes you'll have an error, you'll have maybe a confirmation, a warning. There's a default set of types, which are those. You can expand that. Another useful thing is that it will take flash variables that are arrays. So normally you might just set a string and just output that, but since it does support multiple, just like active record errors, you can actually give a flash an array. And so you could build up multiple confirmation messages or warnings or whatever. Actually, this isn't really a new feature. Error messages for does do this. Not many people use it for that, but it can pull errors from multiple models. If you're, you know, for whatever reason you're saving two models at once, it'll grab all the errors from both of them. And I also have part of it is some JavaScript code that lets you update that much easier than just, you know, creating HTML elements dynamically. And so here's an example of, I mean, basically right there is the whole gem. Kind of a contrived example because you wouldn't really do something like this, but it shows all the features. So if you have two models and you're validating some attributes there, so those are going to have some errors. And then you're setting some other flash messages there. You see the different types. The last one is array syntax. And then so there's a helper called message block, and you can just invoke it like that. You're going to always want to use the on to give it the any active record model instance variables you have. There's a lot of other options, so you can configure this quite a bit. But the default output for that would be there, so it just emits a list of ULs with LIs underneath them. And it does come with a default style sheet and some images. Of course, you can change that and style that however you want. So here's the JavaScript part of it, and I'm kind of embarrassed to say that right now it's just prototype. This was developed quite a while ago, and I've switched to jQuery, but I haven't created a jQuery implementation of it yet. But you can see it's a lot easier to just update those errors if they're already on your page. So if you're doing some sort of AJAX thing where, you know, like an example down here where maybe you're spitting out some JSON with just an array of errors, you can just call .update. That the argument to the constructor, that's just the ID, and that is the default ID it'll give out. You can change that, so you can actually have multiple of these in one page if you wanted to. Installation is real simple. This does require Rails 3. I updated it recently, so it requires Rails 3. I think this may work in Rails 2.3 if you just do script plug and install, but as a gem, it's just in Rails 3. It's tested to use Rails 3. So that rake task there, that will install the style sheet and images. And then if you want to use the style sheet, just include it in your layout there. And that's all you need to use it for. So, so moving on to how this is tested. So this might be a little more interesting. How many people here have used Cucumber before? Okay. How many people have used it to test a gem? Exactly. So testing gems with Cucumber is pretty difficult, it turns out. And I haven't seen many gems out there that are tested using Cucumber. You really would only, well, not necessarily, but you would especially want to do this for Rails plugin gems, right? So things like message block, where it has a helper, and you really want some sort of integration test to make sure the whole thing works, including that rake task I showed. And in order to do this using Cucumber, probably the best technique is to use a host application example. So in other words, generating a Rails app and using the plugin inside there. And so how do you do this with Cucumber? It sounds like it might be pretty simple, but it really isn't. So some people start out by just having a Cucumber step definition that will generate a Rails app. And then, well, what happens there? So there's a lot of problems. First of all, class caching is actually enabled in the test environment by default. So if you're doing multiple scenarios, some very weird things might happen. The other problem is between scenarios, you need to reset the database connection if you're doing migrations. And then the real benefit of using Cucumber, so you can use WebRat or Capybara to actually test output and use all those features. So making that attached to the host application is a little bit difficult because it's a different directory, and that can be challenging. I mean, it depends how you want to set it up, but oftentimes you don't want to regenerate the entire app on every scenario. Usually you just want to generate it once and set it up how you need to test everything and then go through. But the problem with that is that after each scenario, it's got to leave itself in a clean state. So you don't want it leaving behind things. So you've got to kind of reset the application without having to regenerate it. And then doing this with just regular vendor/plugins is simple because you can just symlink it to your main gem. It's a little more difficult if you're using Bundler, because really what you want to do is you want to stick this in the gem file and invoke a bundle install and actually have, emulate as a real person would use this using Bundler. And there's some challenges there. So, so this project, this isn't a gem, it's just a collection of Cucumber step definitions, really. So I created this out of this problem that I was trying to test message block in another gem of mine using Cucumber. And so this tries to address all those problems, testing gems. And so it's just step definitions, and these are the step definitions it gives. So you see things like, given I have a Rails application, so it'll set up your Rails app. And the things indented there are what that basically does behind the scenes. So it'll make sure one's generated, so it'll actually run the generate command and turn off class caching using a regular expression. And then it'll do all the resetting stuff that you need it to do after each scenario runs. So you want to reset the routes file, because you might be changing controller routes and so on. Reset the application controller. And then the bundler stuff, it will ensure that the gem file in the host app contains that gem, and it will actually run bundle install to ensure it's all working. And there's some other steps you can use, things that would be useful, like running commands. You can run a rake command. And then the assertion, you can assert that files were generated. You can save things as files, so that's common. You want to say, I do this in my controller, then what happens? You want to save it as a file. There's an append action, too, for the gem file. So I'm going to show you how it's used inside of message block. So here's the feature file for it, and I have 3 scenarios in here. And the first is just testing that rake task. So when you run that rake task, then those files should exist. So that's pretty simple. And all that's doing is generating the Rails application. It's not actually using Capybara or WebRat to do anything with requests. It's just all running the rake task. The second one is a little more common that you might want to use this for. So given you have a Rails application, you scaffold some model. Setting up the database, that'll make sure that it's all migrated. And then you give it just an example controller. So you save that as your controller. And then, so I'm saving the view, the message block. And when I start the Rails application, so that'll actually load the environment. All that really does is require config/environment and does a few minor other things. And then from this point forward, it's really just like a normal WebRat Cucumber step. So you should see certain things. And I'll show you in a bit that actually running. Let me quickly jump to the last scenario. So this is just a little more involved scenario. It's going to verify it works for using nested attributes. So it's got actually two models here, and then setting up the nested attributes, and you should see the error through there. So I think this could be useful to people that are trying to do Rails plugins, but are currently only testing it kind of at a unit level. And this does have our spec as well for more in-depth testing. But this is important because this will actually verify that someone can use your gem, right? So this will verify the rake task works. It will verify that they start a Rails app, they put it in the gem file. It'll make sure that all works. So it gives you a lot more confidence when you release something. However, a caveat is that you could have too much confidence. I actually ran into a problem with this where I was so reliant on this working and verifying my app that it turns out I forgot to include in the gem spec a directory, the images. And someone had pointed out to me, and I realized that this didn't catch anything because it's not testing the images for one thing, and secondly, it doesn't, it's running off my local version. So it doesn't actually bring the gem down from Gemcutter. It's testing in your gem file against the local copy of it. So yeah, it's called Cukigem. Again, it's really just two files, just step definitions. But if you have a gem and you think it might be useful, then feel free to give it a try. And that's about it. Short talk. Any questions or comments? Yeah, Patrick.
So in terms of the object and the determined class method in Rails, so what did you have like the generic
Yeah, so if you just call message block like just message block and no options, it will not grab anything because it doesn't know what to grab. So in order for it to capture your models as instance variables, you have to do the on clause. So I think what you're asking is, does it grab those instance variables and determine what it can output? Is that what you're asking? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it could be done. Like you could iterate through those and find out which ones are active record and have that sort of be a default case. I didn't do it. I thought it was probably better to leave it to be explicit. But yeah, you could probably do that. Anyone else? All right, I guess it's beer. Yeah, I'm sorry, John. I love it so far. My friends back home are going through a blizzard, so I'm smiling. Yeah, no, I took a picture of my iPhone, the weather app. So here it was like 75 today, and it was sunny, and then in Rochester, literally snow every day, 33. So good time to move, I guess.